from other states showed similar results. To discuss this and much more is Cliff Albright, co-founder of Black Voters Matter. Cliff, welcome to the show. First, given that the lower court found the maps likely to discriminate against black voters, what are the Supreme Court's reasons really to put a hold on that ruling?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Mark. Essentially, they really didn't go into much of a reasoning other than to say that they felt that the lower court's decision implemented before, quote unquote, before the election could cause chaos. And there's a case that they use as precedent, which really wasn't meant for these types of situations, right? It was really meant for these last minute changes before elections, not this situation where you're 4 months away from even the primary taking place. The maps had literally just been drawn, so it's not like there was any major delay. And there was testimony showing that there were alternate maps, fairer maps, a map that would give black voters 2 districts that were basically already prepared. I mean, it wasn't rocket science. And so it's actually more difficult to draw the maps to suppress the black votes. And so there really wasn't much of a rationale. But what they did indicate, and especially Chief Justice Roberts, who, although he sided with the liberal judges in this case, he wasn't siding with black voters or for voting rights. Essentially, what he said in his dissent was that, well, we can give them the stay and let them have this election, and then we'll come back and we'll overturn the law on its merits, or we'll approve the maps on its merits, and then we could just the Republicans can do whatever they want to do for the next elections after that. And so he fully intends, and he indicated this in his dissent, he fully intends to further weaken, in fact, to demolish Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which they had already weakened last year in the Brnovich decision.
What does this decision mean for black Alabama residents? And also help me think about how this can impact all the viewers across these United States in terms of their voting rights.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy what it means for black residents in Alabama. It means that although we represent at least 27%, maybe even more, but at least 27% of the population, that we only have a district, 1 out of 7 districts, where we have a chance at electing somebody that's really of our choice. 1 out of 7 is a 14% chance. So basically, black voters in Alabama have half the representation that we ought to have, which is why the lower court said that there needed to be a map drawn where there were 2 districts instead of just 1 district. So it means that we will continue to only have 1 representative who can speak to our issues, who can represent us in the Congress, and on a range of other issues, And so basically, it just means that black voters are continue to be told, in many ways, the same decision or the ruling that came out of the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision, that black folks have no rights that white folks are bound to respect. That's what it means for black Alabamians. But guess what? It's not just black folks in Alabama, because the court has set its sights on further weakening the Voting Rights Act, which means that this ruling can apply to other maps that are being drawn. That basically what they're attacking is the principle that they even need to try to use the Voting Rights Act to get even close to representation. This isn't an argument about whether or not we have complete proportionality, right? It's not like we're in a case where we're saying, that we've got to have the exact match. But what it's saying is that it's okay for you to not even be close, that there's no expectation that black folks are able to actually use the Voting Rights Act to get not just the right to go vote, but to get representation. That is the principle that John Roberts has been fighting over for decades, including when he had clashes with the likes of Lonnie Guinier and others when the Voting Rights Act was renewed back in the 1980s. He's been salivating over getting rid of the Voting Rights Act for decades, and he's about to put what could be the final nail in the coffin. So this case has ramifications for black voters all across the country. And guess what? Anything that impacts black voters has consequences for the entire country, because any democracy in which our votes are not fully recognized is not a real democracy. That's basically been the battle of America ever since it was founded, or even earlier, going back to 1619, if you will. But that's really been the story of this country. And so everybody suffers when Black folks and other marginalized groups don't have our voting rights. And our efforts to expand our voting rights has led to the expansion of voting rights and voter access for other populations, for women voters, for those with disabilities, for young voters, you name it. That's what happens when we fight for them, when we're given our rights, everybody in the country benefits. And when we don't have our rights, everybody in this country suffers.
The Supreme Court says that it will review the case in full. Can we expect any change in this decision?
No, I mean, there's absolutely no reason to expect why there's a change. At the bare minimum, we know that the 5 conservative, ultra-conservative justices that voted to get rid of the stay, in other words, that voted in favor of the racist Alabama maps, we know how they're going to vote. And we also know how the Chief Justice, who, again, although he sided with the liberals on this question of the stay, he made it very clear in his dissent how he intends to rule when they look at the full merits of the maps and of the law. And so, no, there's absolutely no reason for us to think that they're going to decide any differently than what they've already telegraphed that they're going to rule. And again, the Chief Justice has been telegraphing this for quite some time. At some point, we're going to have a discussion in this country. One, we're going to have to look at a serious discussion around expanding the court. These are not just your standard times, right, where we just go about and accepting the fact that you've got a political court. They have basically weighed in on whether or not Republicans will be able to regain Congress in the upcoming elections. This is very reminiscent of the 2000 Florida election, where the Supreme Court played a role.
Absolutely, I'm glad you said that. That's exactly what it's reminiscent of. And I want to keep this conversation going. I want to pause you here because I want to bring you back on the other side so we can continue the conversation about voting suppression and the work of Black Voters Matter. Everybody stay with me. We've got much more Black news tonight coming up right after the break. We're continuing our conversation about voting rights and the Black community. Joining me is Cliff Albright. He is co-founder of Black Voters Matter. Now, Cliff, regarding the 2020 Washington state elections, what are the evidences that show racial disparities in the rejected mail ballots?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what you're seeing, what you saw in Washington State, we saw it right here in our state of Georgia, where we're just last year in the 2021 cycle, after the passage of the voter suppression bill earlier in the year in Georgia, we saw the same things. What you're seeing is, and this is repeated, where Black vote by mail ballots are routinely rejected at several times the rate. In the case of Washington, at 4 times the rate. You're seeing the same thing in Georgia. You're seeing the same thing in Texas. And so that's why when these states are proposing these bills and they try to act like, you know, they're just neutral bills and that it affects everybody. What we know is we know what the impact of all these policies are. We know what the impact of voter ID policies are. We know what the impact of getting rid of drop boxes are. We know what the impact is of closing polling places or moving polling places. In all instances, it affects Black and marginalized communities, low-income communities. It affects us disproportionately. They know this. These Republican states know this. That's why they're proposing the laws to begin with, and that's why the Supreme Court is allowing them to get away with proposing these laws. And so we've seen this time and time again. It's not rocket science, and yet they continue to say that this is a justified, these are justified restrictions because they're trying to fight a voter fraud which does not exist and has been shown time and time again that it doesn't exist. But what their audits have shown is that Black voters are being impacted disproportionately. That's what the audits are showing.
Now, we talked about these states where disparities are found. I don't want people to think that Washington is an outlier. What are some of the other states where disparities are found?
Yeah, I mean, you name the state, and we're seeing it, you know, in Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Florida. You name the state, wherever they implement these limitations on making it harder to vote by mail. Heck, in the case of Alabama, you know, they were looking at, you know, that you had to not only have ID, but you had to have not one but two signatures to verify it. In some states, they were trying to say that you got to have your application certified by what you call it, the notaries, right? You know, like in the midst of COVID, everybody's got a notary that lives across the street from them, and so anytime you have these restrictions, and on the face of it, somebody might say, "Oh, well, that's reasonable. We need to know who's voting and all that." They know that it's not necessary. They know that there's been no fraud, and more importantly, they know that every time they pass these things, that it's impacting black voters. But you could go down the line at the list of states that implement these policies, and it's the same results all across the board, impacting black voters again 3 times, 4 times, 5 as much. And when you think about these elections that we're talking about, these are all fairly close elections in most of these states. Even if they're not close in the statewide elections, keep in mind, you got races up and down the ballot. So in some counties, you got elections being decided by 10 votes, 100 votes, 200 votes, maybe 1,000 votes. When you're talking about having black voters whose ballots get set aside at 4 times the rate of white ballots,
that's an election decider.
You're talking about. That's an election decider. You don't have to, what they have learned about voter suppression is you don't have to suppress every vote. You just need to suppress just enough to be able to win the election. But guess what? They've also added this other feature of being able to overturn elections. That's why in Georgia, in Fulton County right now, the state is trying to take over the Fulton County Election Board. Why? Because that's where the majority of the state's black voters reside. They don't have to get rid of every county's board of election. They can do it to just one county, like a Fulton County. That's an election decider that would have allowed Trump to get exactly what he wanted when he told the Secretary of State, "Go out and find me 11,700 votes."
Are you suggesting that it's that intentional and that targeted, that there are actually people who are saying, "Look, let's do something in Fulton, let's do something in DeKalb, or in Philadelphia, let's do something in North Philly, or let's do something in West Philly"? I mean, is it that intentional, or is it systemic in a way that people don't know? I'm asking because I want people to understand how this works.
Yeah. It's actually a combination, right? It is intentional by the people that are proposing these laws. It is very intentional. They know better, right? It is very targeted. And that's not just me speaking out of, just guessing. Let me give you 2 pieces of evidence. Think about what Trump was doing and what the insurrection was about, right? It wasn't an insurrection against every voter, right? And it wasn't even an insurrection against every state. What exactly were they fighting against when they tried to overturn the election? They felt that there were certain states where the votes were fraudulent. Where? Georgia, because something was wrong with Atlanta's votes, right? Black folks. Where? Pennsylvania, because something had to be wrong with Philadelphia's votes, right? Black folks. In Michigan, they literally tried to get rid of not just one county, but they wanted to target Detroit in that county, whereas everybody else was fine. Black folks. So what they literally were trying to overturn wasn't just an election writ large. They were trying to overturn black votes. That's what they were targeting. The same way in North Carolina, where the court said that they had created their voter suppression law with surgical precision. The same way as in Texas, where they proposed an entire voter suppression bill, which largely was designed to attack what had been done where in Harris County, where Houston is, black folks, because their county judge had and their election officials had done creative things like 24-hour votings and mobile voting and all of that nature. So they created the law to make sure that nobody else would be able to do what Houston and Harris County had done. Black folks. So yes, I'm not just suggesting that is that intentional. It is very much that intentional, and we've seen the surgical precision. And even when you look at the language of the laws, and the history in Texas, their law, the purpose of the law said that it was to restore the purity of the ballot. If that language sounds familiar, that's because that's language that literally came out of their post-Reconstruction. Yes, they use the same language. So when we say this is Jim Crow 2.0, that is not hyperbole. They are using the same language and the same rationales, and yes, the same tactics that were used all throughout Jim Crow. So it's very intentional. But with that said, it is also very systematic, where you do have some people that just buy into the language, which isn't even a dog whistle. It's very much a bullhorn. So it's this combination of some people acting very intentionally who know better, but they use the big lie to persuade a whole bunch of other folks who maybe don't know better. But at the end of the day, there's a reason why so many people believe the big lie. It's because it is to their racial privilege, their white supremacy, that makes them more susceptible.
They have an investment in believing the big lie. No, that absolutely makes sense. Cliff, I want to thank you for joining me on Black News tonight. Keep up the great work you all are doing with Black Voters Matter. We'll be sure to have you back soon, everybody. Stay right here. We'll be back with more Black News.